Good afternoon. We're going to get started. Welcome to today's Islandora webinar, Build Repository Roadmap. March 25th, 2015. About 80 people registered to listen live to this webinar and have many more listening to the recording. So welcome to one and all. We have people joining us from all over the world today. People in China, in Brazil, in Canada, the US, and Europe, so welcome. I just asked a quick question on the chat at just what time it was in people's jurisdictions, and I think the latest we have is it's midnight in China right now. So Louisa, thank you for joining us. I'm a librarian and business development manager at Discovery Garden, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Alan Stanley, who is a developer and subject matter expert. And Alan will be moderating the Q&A session after today's main presentation. So for those of you listening live, I just want to instruct you on how you can ask questions. You can post comments or questions throughout the presentation, but the main Q&A session will be in about 20 minutes or 30 minutes. So if you look to the top of your screen, there should be an expandable menu. And it should be a button. Click that button and it should appear on your screen. A few people having audio trouble. Alan, you could respond to a few people who are not able to hear right now. That would be great. You too, if you don't see the comment button or the chat button, there should be an options menu, and there's a QA button as well. So you can use either the Q&A option or the chat option to communicate with us. You who have typed in to say you're having difficulty hearing, my colleague Alan will try to respond to your question. Started. And it is going to be fairly simple. Like I said, the presentation will take about 20 to 30 minutes. We'll with introductions. I'll introduce Discovery Garden and also Islandora, the software and the community. After that, we'll get into the heart of the conversation for today, which is building repository roadmaps. We're going to be speaking about repository planning or roadmaps in context of pilot projects, so stakeholders, scope and requirements, and really interrogating your content or understanding your data. And as mentioned, we'll follow up afterward with a Q&A session. Introductions. We're going to start with Discovery Garden. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Discovery Garden, it's a company that was launched in 2009, and it came out of a commercialization project at the University of Prince Edward Island. Discovery Garden is a partner in the Islandora Foundation. The foundation is a nonprofit organization that fosters the Islandora Code and project. And both the Islandora Foundation and Discovery Garden are dedicated to the long-term sustainability of the Islandora project. Discovery Garden is the primary committer of Islandora Code. That means that we create modules and then we commit the new modules and tools that we create back to the Islandora open source software community. It positioned us as a leading subject matter expert on Islandora, enables us to create services such as installation, assessment, consulting, development, and migration services for people who may need some help with their Islandora repository. And we employ a vast range of staff members, including developers, solution architects, which are essentially project managers with development backgrounds, librarians, quality assurance testers, and support staff. Now, for those who are new to Islandora, it's essentially a collection of 3 very well-known and very capable open source software projects. The presentation and collaboration layer is Drupal. So many of you have heard of Drupal probably in the past. A lot of academic institutions are using Drupal for their website. layer for search and discovery, we use Apache Solr for those tools. The storage and preservation layer is for Commons. It provides us with a way to create beautiful websites. It's a powerful theming layer. So when you go to a website, the look, the colors, the features on the front page, those are elements of a theme. And it also enables us to create responsive designs that are for mobile viewing and tablet viewing. In addition to that, Drupal provides terrific framework for users, roles, and permissions. And users, roles, and permissions are very important for any workflow. It creates really easy to use user interfaces for configuring different parts of Islandora. An example is the Solr settings interface. It creates a place for a site administrator to go in and configure advanced search or facets. For a wonderful example of a Drupal site or of a Drupal theme, the most recent example that I could think of today was the Metropolitan New York Library Council. They've yet to launch, but are close to launching, and I just adore their theme. Some details about Apache Solr. It's an enterprise search service for search and discovery. So you ingest digital assets into Islandora. It provides full-text searching capabilities, near-real indexing, search and filtering, and also the capability to ingest geospatial information. An example of using geospatial information in a digital repository would be to view your search results on a map, for instance. Fedora Commons. And that is a powerful framework for storage and preservation. It's to the OAIS reference model with support for SIPs, APEs, and DIPs. It has support for millions of objects, audit fixity checks, support for virtually any file or metadata type, and it's highly extendable. And by highly extendable, we mean that it's easy to integrate with other services or external services. Islandora just explains what we call solution packs. And packs are just Drupal modules that help us build digital repositories. And solution pack is a template or a recipe for expressing digital assets. Here we have different types: image, book, newspaper, multimedia, and therefore expressing specific types of content. Solution pack dates what file types can be ingested, which derivatives are generated automatically on ingest, and also which viewer will be used to expose that digital asset. That's just a quick description of Islandora as a software framework. The community is growing at a very rapid pace. Implementations of Islandora have increased the last 18 months, really since Islandora 7 came out, and particularly the release last May. I think it was Islandora 7 1.4. Implementations have gone through the roof. And here are just some logos of institutions that have implemented Islandora. The community, I feel, is one of the strongest assets of this software, because we have a group of very motivated and passionate people who are looking to drive the software forward and make it sustainable for the long term. And a quick geographic representation of Islandora installations. We have primarily lots of installations in North America and Europe, but if you can see that there's an installation in Brazil, installations in Australia, and also now in China. To get into the good stuff, the reason why we all came here today. So let's talk about building a repository roadmap. I'm going to start off this section with thinking about the grocery list approach. Excuse me. Those of you who have never heard of the grocery list approach, it essentially means building your repository plans around specific modules or specific technology. maybe you get excited about a tool set that you've heard about in a presentation or demo, and you say, you know what, I really want to work with that. The grocery list can be great, but it doesn't guarantee a good repository. So we say, let's avoid focusing on the what and the how, or these modules and specific technologies. Instead, focus on the who and the why. The reason why we ask people to focus on the who and the why is that there are consequences to plan technology. That some details can be overlooked, and when I say details, I mean workflow or usability. And you can also have unforeseen integration consequences. So will these technologies work together? Do they overlapping functionality? Things like that. I suggest a repository roadmap process. It's formulaic, so it can be revised to fit your organization or to fit your project. So our suggestion is to start with a pilot project. Something as easy as identifying and testing software. Enable you to spend a small amount of time and money and potentially save you a lot of time and money in the future. And this is twofold: to evaluate the feasibility of going from a pilot scale to a full scale, and to that, gain support for your project. So in a small, defined project, you ensure that your test users or pilot users have a positive experience, and that will spread the word for a larger scale project in the future. Seeing more and more pilot projects be suggested to us. We have an Islandora on demand or a cloud version of Islandora. I created a very small level of service. It's a bronze service. I think it's only $7 a year for a very small amount of data. But the purpose there is just to try it out, to go on testing on a VM or go beyond testing on a sandbox. Just try it out for a year, try it out for 3 months to see if it's the right fit for you. You've had your pilot project approved. The next very vital part is identifying your stakeholders. And so it goes back to our suggestion of focusing on the who. Who's planning our repository for? Who is curating and who will be interacting with content? Is it scholars? Is it librarians or archivists? Is it for the general public? Also ask, who do we want to be happy with the system? Partners, funders, donors, users, all of those people. But who is the core? Who do we have to make happy for this repository project to be a success? A very important question to ask is, who will be maintaining this system? And when we talk about maintenance, you can do it in many different ways. You can do it in terms of maintaining hardware, in ways of maintaining software with updates and upgrades. You could also think of it in terms of who will be growing the repository, who will be enabling its sustainability over the long term. These questions are intended to help you identify your stakeholders, and identifying stakeholders is vital for the next step in the process, identifying your scope. So when you identify your scope, you're switching from who to why. Find out you're planning this repository project to define very high-level objectives for the project. Ways to help you define scope is to get to know your stakeholders. They can help you find the objectives for this project. The tip is watch people using the existing repository, or if they don't have an existing repository, talk to them about pain points and then focus the objectives of the repository project on solving those pain points. A funny suggestion is to ask obvious and silly questions. We were at an Islandora camp in British Columbia last month. A colleague, Mitch McKenzie, who's a solution architect, had a really funny anecdote about a project manager he worked with in the past. And he knew this guy really well, but everyone thought he was kind of silly because he was like the Captain Obvious guy on those commercials, those hotel commercials. He was always kind of stating the obvious. After reflection, after a long time, he came to realize that he was the most effective project manager he had ever known. He was always testing people's assumptions. So the obvious and silly questions, so we need to put our pride aside and challenge the assumptions of our own assumptions and the assumptions of the people that we're working with. So that I found was a really great suggestion from Mitch. Is defining requirements. And in this step, we get back to the who again. We want to focus on the people who will be using and interacting with this repository. So a really good suggestion from Mitch McKenzie was to create user personas. So there's a librarian, there's an archivist, there's a researcher, scholar, faculty member. And you can define objectives per persona. And way, it keeps the requirements building kind of general, and we're not assigning requirements to specific members or individuals on our team. And why this is helpful is because it takes the personal element out of it. So if Aaron, the librarian, is keen on data interoperability, it'd be a little bit more personal if my requirements were cut, if we had to narrow the scope of the pilot, let's say. Sometimes creating personas, it enables you to put yourself in someone else's shoes, and it doesn't assign a specific name of one of your team members to requirements. So if you're narrowing or widening scope, it's not as personal. Another suggestion is to create what we call user stories to define functional requirements. So the structure is there on the screen. As a librarian, I want to edit metadata so that the versions of metadata records are available to me, or something like that. So functional requirements, I find, are very specific to the institution. Although Discovery Garden has worked with many different types of memory institutions, some of which are in similar categories, such as academic libraries or social archives and collections, we do see very specific and unique user stories come out of every institution. So this is a very worthwhile exercise. We say spend a significant amount of time on defining requirements is that it provides clarity, but it also provides context for implementers. So let's say you're asking a developer on your staff or service provider to undertake a development task. And some people say, well, why? I don't understand why you want me to do that. To me, it doesn't make sense. A really clear user story, it provides context for that implementer and can sometimes help you gain support throughout the process of building a repository. Now, it is really interesting. This garden started implementing Agile project management and Agile development process a couple years ago. We started with a waterfall management approach and then switched to Agile because we saw value in iteration. So planning for iteration means that we try to decrease complexity whenever possible. It means don't give yourself a 50-page repository plan to be implemented immediately. Prioritize, which of course can be very difficult, especially when you have a large group of stakeholders, but best to prioritize. It's probably the most important and maybe the most difficult thing that any group needs to do in repository planning. Prioritize and will help to decrease the complexity of the project because when you prioritize, you break projects into phases that can be implemented sequentially. And once you identify a phase, you can determine which components and dependencies are involved. Here, planning for systems-related tasks. This is a really important one. Whether your repository hosted on internal software or on an internal hardware rather, as an institution, you may have an department who is going to be building a server for you and setting up a server for you for your install. Be sure to plan time for those tasks. Also, plan time for feedback. And this is important. For people who are not visionaries, myself included, it's difficult for me to understand what I want my repository to look like and act like, and to have a proof of concept in front of me. Try something to ingest into, to edit, see, and view. Sometimes you need to do first iteration, time for testing and feedback, and redefine requirements based on that feedback. And essentially, it's the definition of agile project management. This last part, interrogating your content. This is a really interesting part. This is where we all of the assumptions we have about our data. So in the process, we're going to verify the formats or types of data that we have, where it's stored, and also identify any outliers. And when I'm talking about outliers, it could be that a particular curator had a certain flavor of mods or Mark XML that was a little bit different than other curators. Perhaps the institution was using a bit of odd image file format for 2 years between, in 82. So identifying outliers can sometimes be really challenging. And we verify this information is weekly request sample data for 10% of the entire data set, but to be representative of the whole. You have 10,000 images that you want to ingest or migrate. You can take 10% of one collection. It has to be 10%, and it has to be pulled from all different sources of data. So you may be lucky and may be migrating only from one data source, and that's wonderful. But you are migrating or ingesting from multiple locations, multiple formats, you need to make sure that your sample data is representative. And when we do a review of sample data to verify formats, location, things like that, we tend to use a scripted process to review data. And one of our developers will typically put together a script, and it will spit out a log that tells us how many objects of which type, and it'll also report on metadata as well. So we do it, but people and institutions can do that in many different ways. Ways a bit more manual, of course. For the review of the representative sample data set, I'm going to ask people to think about how their data is going to map into the Islandora information architecture. And so I think when I talk about information architecture, I'm talking about in Islandora or Fedora, a data stream structure. And let's have a sample here that I'll bring up. And so it's a large image object in Islandora. And so here I'm looking at its data streams. And we ask people to take a look at their large images, TIFFs and JP2s, and we say, how will your data fit into the Islandora information architecture? And here, do you have relationship information to enter migrate? Or maybe starting from scratch in Islandora. Descriptive metadata like mods or DC. The preparation file is the OBJ data stream. That's pretty easy. And then what derivatives do you have in your data? Will you be getting rid of them and regenerating new ones? Or do you want to migrate or ingest your existing derivatives like technical metadata or lower resolution images or thumbnails, things like that? So that's kind of the next step. After determining what type of data, how much of it, the location and outliers, then we ask you to kind of plug and play. Do you expect your data to be ingested and look like this, or will it look differently? And how? The two bullets are really just a follow-up on thinking about your information architecture. Do you have detailed expectations of how migrated content will look, behave, and be stored? And have customizations that your staff or users want to maintain. So in your first round of testing, you would understand what the standard set of the software is. Do you have things that you'd like to change about that? And in question, I would also say, what implications will a customization have on updating or upgrading in the future? Depending on what the customization is, it could have very little impact or it could have a larger impact. So it's worth considering as well. To follow up on the last slide, the native content will influence a number of things in Islandora. So XML forms are for indexing and editing metadata, for indexing descriptive metadata, displaying metadata, and it also impacts your collection structure or hierarchy. So those are things to keep in mind when interrogating your content. If there are changes to the mappings or to the information architecture, once the project has already started, it can cascade into more issues. So that's why interrogating and understanding your data is so important, very important part of the planning process. So we're to the end of the presentation portion. Just a review of our suggestion for a repository roadmap. So the initial step is to conduct some initial tests on software. A lot of us have 30-day trials, or there are sandboxes. Within the Islandora community, there's a Discovery Garden sandbox and an Islandora Foundation sandbox. Create a short list of software and vendors. Project approved. Projects in institutions will involve only one repository software. In institutions, it can involve 3. So it's for timeline. A pilot can be 3 months, 1 year, 3 years. So pilot is really going to be specific to your project, to your timeline, to your stakeholders. After the pilot project is approved, we're going to identify stakeholders, scope, and define requirements. And to test the software against those requirements. Find out if the standard services and features are going to be enough. Again, the requirements, and if customization is needed, we recommend that those customizations are professionally assessed by a service provider. And we suggest this because whether the development is done by a service provider or by a developer at your institution, we want to ensure that all customization is done to Drupal coding standards and put through a good quality assurance process so that the end result will work for your institution. The step is to execute your phased repository project, and that's when the fun really begins. To go, I'm going to unmute my colleague Alan. I'm watching the comments and QA sections of WebEx to our QA session. Alan, are you there?
Here, I'm looking at the chat window. I don't actually have a separate QA window.
I'll take a look here too.
So I don't know if that's been accumulating comments as we go.
All right. I don't, sir. Would anyone like to submit a question for Alan or myself on repository planning?
A little bit, we can't get too specific, but if you wanted to talk about actual implementations, about what types of data are accessible, if you want to make any modifications to data structure, we could spend a little time on that as well.
Yeah, you likely have many anecdotes you could share, Alan, but what stands out in your mind of, you know, some customizations that typically come from this planning process?
Well, I think a good example, and this is something that went up on our blog very recently. It was a relatively large migration we're doing for a university in Ireland. And one of the things that we particularly enjoy about this process is we get to see a lot of pretty interesting stuff. There's some really interesting collections out there. And this was a collection of postcards. have a standard input format. But by the discussion with the repository manager and looking at some of the original materials, we're able to look at that and see that it was a slightly interesting case. Generally, with a digital asset, you have exactly one thing of interest. So it's a picture, it's a JPEG, it's an audio file. Postcard, you had two things of interest. You had the recto and the verso. You had the front side and the back side that comprised a whole. They were very interesting and for very different reasons. There's people interested in the front because they want to see the actual subject material. They want to see the styles of photography. It can be representative of either architecture of a certain time or a certain place, or with some of the humorous postcards, you can even look back and see this is the sort of things that people thought were funny in the 20s. Stuff to look at. But then on the other side, where you had the bit that was written on, they'd see the types of communication they were doing, and this is going to be of interest for people. It's going to be of interest to stamp collectors. You can look at the stamp. It's going to be of interest to philologists who are looking at the use of language from a time and a place, what kind of messages were sent. So we were able to expose this data in a number of interesting ways. What we were able to do with this particular one is look at how the collection was configured, and it really didn't take long. We're talking about a half an hour of coding. I was able to put together a nice routine for them to do a ingest, where if we had our data configured properly, and we just did a naming convention here, so it'd be image 001A, image 001B would be the recto and the verso. We could combine those into a single unit. We extract the mods data from another field and apply that and come up with a complete object quite quickly, programmatically, quite easily. One of those things that if I hadn't had a chance to sit down with Caleb, who's my friend from Limerick, if we had a chance to sit down and talk about it, we could have spent a lot of time found around until we came up with something that suited everybody. Through the planning process, we were able to come up with a pretty quick solution. And it's one of the things that I find to be especially important about planning is looking at general time management. So as a programmer, we can make anything do anything, but it's not always easy. So we'll look at sometimes is if we have a collection with, say, an unusual directory structure. There's 10 things in it, it might be easier to relabel them. If there are things in it, it's probably going to be easier to write the code. So a nice way to find out what the balance is, chance for everybody to do everything, and it makes sure that those people who are paying for services are getting good value for their money. We don't, as I say, we can do almost anything with your input data, but very often much easier for you to align it for us than it is for us to manipulate it. So questions. And I don't see the Q&A box yet, Erin.
We have a couple questions. One is from Louisa Lam in China, and she asks what the most time-consuming part of building a brand new repository is. I think that really depends on the objectives of the repository and the amount of data that I have as well. Or I think prioritizing tasks is the most difficult part of build repository. Alan, would you say that ingest or metadata mapping might be the most time consuming?
Well, it depends what we're talking about time consuming. We had, can sometimes take a long time. We have huge migration processes where the actual migration could take a period of weeks. But it wasn't hands-on weeks. It's setting up the job and then coming in to check on it from time to time. So you were fairly accurate in your initial comment that it's coming up with a data structure that makes sense to you. You've got and it's deciding what portions of that data is important to you. Something we focus on a lot here. It's my particular passion is the digital humanities. And that I try to focus on as much as possible is to make the data accessible in as many different ways to as many different interested parties as possible. So the data should absolutely meet the use case of the person putting it in or the institution putting it in. But it's also nice to have it exposed on a geographic and a temporal basis, so that different types of data can be extracted from that. We're seeing things like climate science going in and having a look at pictures taken for historical reasons, where they weren't considering the climate at all. But if it's properly documented, if we get an image and we can say, this is what this picture looked like on April 21st of 1880, then we have a pretty good idea of what the snow record was like for that year. So we try to expose that in interesting ways. So the whole concept to make sure that the data is properly structured, the organization makes sense, and to set up your metadata in such a way that anything that might be of interest to anybody is easily discoverable.
I think time-consuming tasks will really differ depending on the project, the data, the use cases. But certainly, I think it's worth discussing in more detail. And I think we could probably follow up offline too, Louisa, just to answer some more specific questions. I'm looking in the QA box here, and I see a question from Brendan, and have a specific use case for a consortial environment. So they have multiple institutions working under one banner and working together to put together an institutional repository network. So Brendan's question is, in this consortial context, do you have insight on how we might go about gathering user stories? Any experience from previous projects you've worked on? I'll take a stab at this one, Brandon. In the pilot phase, it's to keep the scope really clear and potentially narrow. Anytime you're increasing complexity with the number of stakeholders, which it sounds like in this instance it is, it means that you should likely keep the use cases or the scope for that project really tight. So identify the stakeholders within your consortium, identify their main objectives, and then select a few of them. And this is where it's the hard part, because keeping everyone happy in a consortial environment is really difficult. You have a lot of people with different objectives and different timelines and different budgets and all kinds of other pressures. So I think that's probably the most difficult part, is the wrangling and then the narrowing of objectives so that you can have a successful pilot. Because the pilot is really quite important for ensuring people have a positive experience and are enthusiastic about going full scale. So I think that just your stakeholders focus on specific functionality and it balloon out into other types of functionality. And so this functionality really will differ. It's primarily scholarly publications or archives and special collections. So choosing those objectives and the focus is really the most important first step. Helpful, it may not have been at all. All right, so I'm going to go back into the chat window. And here, there's a question from Rachel. What are tips to gain support from management as well as coworkers? I'm going to take a stab at that.
That's a really difficult question. It depends a lot on the particular culture of your workplace and your environment. In general experience, it's important to think in terms of what it's going to do for the individuals involved. So if we start with something that seems obvious to you, like saying repositories are awesome, and repositories, by the way, are awesome, not particularly helpful to somebody who has not yet come to that. So it's important to say what this will do for your organization, what this will do with the individual, and it can be on a very pragmatic level. It's going to be easier to find your stuff now. It can be on a higher level. You can say it's going to be easier for other people to find your stuff now. But without knowing the culture of a particular organization, the easiest thing we can do is express how and if this is going to make somebody's life either easier or more complete. So I realize that's a pretty fuzzy answer. That's something that varies so much from institution to institution and place to place. We have, there was a large organization that we were dealing with a few years ago, whose name I will very specifically not mention, where somebody from the IT department came in and looked and said, your solution is so much better than ours, but mine, so I'm not going to change it. In that case, it's what you can do about it except wait for the individual to retire, which is what we did.
I do, in gaining support, I often find that, I mean, there are use cases where people feel that open source is in the academic community because it's community-based development, community-driven development, so that your priorities are really at the core or at the heart of the future of the product. So that times is a way to encourage people to go for repositories, and particularly in open source. In other ways, use a repository platform to expose digital assets. You know, making them searchable in Google, you can have them harvested by other external search services like WorldCat, Summon, Preventral, you know, Google or things like that. So depending on what their objectives are, I feel like we can make compelling cases. So for anyone having a difficult time trying to make that business case, let me know. I have a lot of material. We can cater information to make that case. So in a lot of situations in the past, people have said, we're really excited about this project, but we just can't get the administration or the bosses on side. So if you need any kind of material like that, please let me know, and I'm happy to help. We got another question here. Oh gosh, there's a lot of them now.
There's one that's been in the chat window for a while about making ingestion easier to handle.
Sure.
And I'd speak to that very quickly. And it's an excellent question, because ingestion, you have normally when you're setting up a repository, you have a stable of existing assets, and you want to put those in a meaningful way, them and ingest them, keep them safe. From our point of view, the biggest thing that the repository manager can do is make sure all their data is consistent. So consistently named, easy to find. We can program our way around just about anything, but we have to know what it is that we're dealing with. So if you have a chance when you're extracting data from one system to another, and we have lots of experience with migrating from almost anything, if we can keep our naming conventions consistent, if we can make sure that things are where they ought to be. A huge one is naming your files in such a way that they're sortable in a meaningful way. So for instance, book pages, they can be sorted alphabetically. So if you're naming them cover page 1, page 2, that's going to work. But if the back cover is called back cover, that's going to show up at the front. So make sure that your naming conventions are reasonable and reliable. And that's something we can, or whoever is doing your repository can work with you. System input formats, system styles. The more metadata we can get our hands on, the better. We can build a more meaningful object that way.
Well, thanks, Alan.
Just very quickly, have a follow-up question from Jeff there. Yeah, and that's excellent. And everything I said before just kind of gets subdivided. So don't have to deal with an entire collection as though it was a single block of stone. So if we have different collections with different properties, all we do is document that, and then it becomes a series of 4 or 5 mini migrations. It's often the better way to go.
All right, let's see to Celia Rose. She says, the institutional repository of the institution that has development in DSpace, and my question is, how are the bits of Islandora in the case of changing? So it's a case of a DSpace to Islandora migration, and reasons for migration really are unique to the people managing that repository. And so it could be that you simply want new features or different features, that there are things that you don't like about your existing software platform and that you feel that you will like about Islandora. So in context, I would definitely suggest doing some testing on a sandbox site or a VM, or requesting a 30-day trial. I know that we have a 30-day hosted trial for people, and that's how you can kind of make your case for migration. And are afraid of migrations because they can be difficult. You know, you're going from one repository platform to another, and it involves sometimes changing your information architecture, mapping metadata. So sometimes migrations can be scary. I often like to frame them as an opportunity to standardize your data. Migration can be a wonderful opportunity because you can take what you have right now in your existing repository and say, I'm going to map it to mods. I'm going to make it more granular. I'm also going to make sure that technical metadata is derived in the new repository. Things like this. So it can be scary, but also a terrific opportunity to standardize and improve data. Specific use cases for switching from DSpace, I think would be very individual to the people or the team managing that repository. A question here from Marcy at Rochester, and wondering about the on-demand service. So the on-demand service is our cloud-hosted service. It's like a platform. And she asks, when Fedora 4 becomes integrated into Islandora, will all of your on-demand services be updated to use Fedora 4? That's a really good question, Marcy. And essentially, the Fedora 4 integration is still in its infancy. The release is planned, I believe, for June 2015, with our first iteration of a production release due in the fall of 2015. However, when we move from one version to a major upgrade, it all happens in sections. So right now we have Islandora 1.5, that's the version that's the public release right now. And it includes a solution pack, and includes the Islandora Solr suite of tools for institutional repositories. So it includes a large feature set, a large upgrade. What will happen is we kind of move each solution pack over one at a time. And so the Islandora Foundation, the nonprofit that fosters the code, they are essentially at the helm of that project, although Discovery Garden is involved. So the timeline will in part be determined by development through the foundation. Also, customers that ask us to port some packs from the existing version to Fedora 4. So we go from like Drupal 6 to 7. That's how that big change went. I assume the same will go for like Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. I think the details of the move to Fedora 4 are still to be determined. I don't think that we would move our on-demand customers automatically until that release has a very robust tool set or a tool set comparable to the one that we have now. I know it's a super long question and probably clear as mud, but I hope that helps in that question. So it won't be happening right at the outset because the new release likely wouldn't have as many tools and features. Alan, any comments on that?
No, I think it's a good question, and I think we're all quite interested to see what's going to happen going forward. I'm down in Washington next week to see what the current state of the art with Fedora 4 is, and I think it's going to be quite exciting. But I think there's going to be a fair amount of work to implement it. So as soon as it becomes available, I would see on-demand service being available. I don't think we would ever get to the point that people just saw their data being flipped without consultation. Somewhere.
So we have a few more questions here. And there's one from Jenny at Queens, and she's asking if there's any sample data we can provide. Absolutely. If you don't have sample data to test with, just send me a quick email and I can provide you with a few different formats and also some metadata. I'm going to mute Alan temporarily. Another question from Brandon is, a big challenge he anticipates will be facing a common metadata standard for multiple institutions. That's a really big challenge, I agree. But unifying a metadata profile is possible. It takes some time and patience and also a fairly good understanding of the metadata standards you're working with. Work with her name is Liza. She's based in the States, and she's a metadata librarian. And anytime we have questions about mapping metadata profiles, we normally go to her. And it's really important to be able to bounce ideas and mappings off of your colleagues. It's a collaborative effort, and it's also one of those things where there will be trade-offs. You may have to sacrifice some granularity to unify your metadata profile. It is possible, and a very no cause. It will really benefit your institution, I guess your consortia as a whole, and the institutions that fall under it, because it will make editing, maintaining your data, and of course discovery just better.
Erin's absolutely right about that. It's one of the reasons that we tend to default to mods. So our rule is we use mods unless there's a compelling reason to use anything else. Perfect, nothing is. Very granular and allows data from different institutions to be looked at, combined, evaluated. Makes it easier to do cross-platform searching. So you're probably never going to find a single metadata standard that makes everybody in the world happy. But the close come to an accepted standard. Things, of course, evolved. It wasn't long ago that everybody thought Dublin Core was going to be just wonderful, and then discovered that it wasn't nearly granular enough. It still has many, many uses. It tends to be as a backup. It tends to be as a more simplified face on deeper levels. But yeah, it's an interesting question. We can go on and on about metadata, and we frequently do. It's something that can take you years to figure out.
Okay, let's see. There was a question here from Tristan. He was asking, how do I convince decision makers of the value of the who and the why questions? He says his organization is excited about technology, but there's a tendency to focus on the what and the how. Really common. I find that, I mean, especially right now, it's conference season, and there's lots of demos and presentations, and people come home from conferences and they say, you hear about this new tool I just heard about, and I saw this most incredible demonstration, and we'll get to work and really they're inspired, and that's what conferences are great for. But sometimes it can have that negative impact where you forget about the users, you forget about the stakeholders. And I would argue, Tristan, that to help convince them of the value of the who and the why, or solving the problems of stakeholders, is that's how the meaningful work is done. That's where you get your meaningful anecdotes at the end of your project, saying, look at these problems we solved. Look at the benefits we created. So I would say that it measures the success. The who and the why is how you measure the success of your repository project. And then you can go to a conference and present on your why and inspire other people to do the same. So it's not a terrific argument, but it's the only one I have right now. So more questions here. I'm back to the Q&A, the Q window here, and we only have 5 minutes left. So for anyone who are unable to respond to within the hour, I'll email you a response afterward. I see a question from Joseph. About compound objects. So this is the project that you were talking about, Alan, at the University of Limerick. So how successful has Discovery Garden been in migrating compound objects plus metadata to Islandora from other digital asset management systems? What are some of the problems you've encountered, and how have you solved
Experience with this, and for the most part, you can think of a compound object as being kind of a specialized collection. It's got a few extra niceties that go along with it. For instance, you can take the components of a compound object and you can hide them from direct discovery. In other words, if you have 7 or 8 components to a compound object, and the search returns one of those components at the repository manager's discretion. Instead of returning that component as the search, it can return the entire compound object if you would rather that that particular bit of information be seen in context. Generally, we just have to make sure that everything's properly organized. So what we do, for the most part, is migrate collections, and a compound object can absolutely be seen as a specialized collection. So in order to make the migration of compound objects successful, we just have to be well organized and discoverable. So when we have a pile of digital assets, we have to know what goes with what, and look at your individual use case and see if that's done more meaningfully by putting them in folders. So it would not be unusual, for instance, have a tree structure with a folder that held all the component objects in it, and then component objects within that could either be either separate digital assets, or it could be a series of subfolders, which would be tying digital assets together with metadata. Sometimes we have metadata associated with the component, but sometimes we don't. So again, it comes back to what I was talking about earlier. If our data is properly mapped, it's not particularly difficult. Where we get into trouble is when we have things that aren't properly identified, aren't properly mapped, and we're not really sure programmatically how to deal with those. We can go a long way with extensions. If something has a JPG on the end of it, we're pretty sure it's a JPEG. If it has XML on the end of it, we have a sniff test that we can tell whether it is whether it's mods or DC, and that's easily expanded to other content types, where we can go in and examine the structure of the XML. But again, that takes a little bit more planning. So really, the short answer to all this is if your incoming data is properly organized, it makes the ingest of it forward. And this kind of ties back to some of the questions we had earlier. If it's not organized, it's still very ingestible. It just might have to be done in much smaller pieces. We have one of the migrations I've done recently, we had a directory structure that had to be maintained in terms of sort of room, shelf, folder, file. It's fairly easy to come up with something that mimicked that. We had to know what we were dealing with, and then write some specific code that would deal exactly with that use case. So most migrations, I think you can consider most meaningfully to be a series of smaller migrations. So you don't generally move an entire collection at once. You move pieces of that. And the more homogeneous that collection is, the larger the pieces you move can be.
What Alan just mentioned really gets to the heart of the slide, focused on interrogating your content. So really understanding and organizing the data before it's moved, I think, really get to the heart of many of the problems in migrating, whether it's an image or a compound object with multiple images, certainly. Okay, let's do one last question from Andrew. He asks, when planning a repository migration, what steps should be taken to transform traditional metadata into linked data? And that's a loaded one. I think it depends on how extensive your linked data will be. I've seen examples where you have relationships expressed in RDF, or relationship description framework. And so that's really basic, and you can export that and have that displayed or exposed as linked data. Other people take it to, because there are levels of linked data, I guess is what I'm trying to explain. So at a base level, having relationships identified in RDF is one, and that's standard in Islandora. Other projects take it to additional levels and link to external services, like external authorities, like geonames, or specific thesauri, like there's an institution in the Netherlands called Delft. It's the Technical University of Delft. And horrific art architecture repository, we're linked to geonames for geographic authorities and also GAAT, the Arts and Architecture Thesaurus. So they have a specific set of forms that facilitates that process, but depending on what your objectives of your linked data are, the process may be different. So I have a really basic answer, Andrew, and I can get into more detail, but it would depend what your objectives for linked data are, because there are many different levels of linked open data. And to mention also that for in the conversations that we've had about Fedora 4, they've been talking about linked data capability as one of the top new features that is coming into effect. Right now, Islandora has the makings of linked open data. It stores relationships in RDF, has persistent identifiers. It's available on the web. It doesn't have a Sparkle endpoint, so you can't export the ships in real time, expose them in real time. So we're looking to have improvements in that area when we integrate with Fedora 4. Alan, anything to add there?
So I think they covered it pretty nicely.
Okay. Or if that's not detailed enough, you can certainly follow up with people in email. We haven't been able to get to all of the questions in the window chat, but it will be downloaded when I download the recording, and I'll do my very best to follow up with people by email. For those of you listening to the recording of this webinar, please send your questions to the email address on your screen. It's info@discoverygarden.ca. I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us today, and please get in touch if you need anything at all. Thank you.